What's one moment in your life that changed everything in your family?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Do you know your true worth when the people who raised you put a price tag on it? Because I learned mine the hard way, and it was exactly $0. When I first sat my parents down and told them that I had been accepted into a great school, I did not expect a parade or confetti, but I did think they might at least ask what I needed to get started. Instead, my dad folded his arms and said, "College is your choice, so paying for it is your responsibility." My mom nodded along, adding that it was time I learned how the real world worked. That was the end of the conversation, and I walked out of that room with the kind of silence you only get when you realize that nothing you say will change anything. A week later, my sister Ava came bouncing down the driveway to find a brand new luxury SUV with a bow on top. I stood in the doorway and watched as my parents clapped, hugged her, and posted a picture online with some caption about rewarding hard work. I was still calculating how to cover a housing deposit while they were uploading photos about sacrifice and pride. It was not about the car itself. It was about the fact that they told me there was no money to support me at all, not even a single dollar, yet somehow they had found the budget to buy her leather seats and surround sound. That contrast cut deep, and I swallowed every word that wanted to come out. I did not fight them. I did not beg. Instead, I took my acceptance letter and walked straight into the financial aid office. I applied for everything I could, and when the call came that I had been awarded a full scholarship, I printed it out and held it in my hands for a long time. That paper meant more than just tuition. It meant freedom. My mother left me a voicemail saying, "That's a cute little freebie, but don't think it replaces responsibility." I saved that voicemail and tucked it away, because sometimes you know that proof will matter later. From that moment, I built a plan like my life depended on it. I signed up for an on-campus job that would cover my groceries. I arranged my schedule so I could grab shifts in the library, and I learned every hack from older students about how to stretch a dollar. Used textbooks, meal plan leftovers, shared rides. I did it all without complaint, because the alternative was asking for help from people who had already told me what my worth was. Ava, meanwhile, was posting road trip pictures every weekend, tagging our parents and writing about how grateful she was for their generosity. She never once asked how I was doing, and maybe that was the part that stung more than the SUV itself. I realized then that my family did not just have favorites, they had an audience to impress, and I was not part of the show. So I took my first quiet step of revenge, and it was not dramatic. I went back to the registrar and filed paperwork that blocked my parents from having any access to my records. No billing information, no grade reports, nothing. If they wanted to know what was happening in my life, they would have to ask me directly, and I had no plans to share. Then I sent them a one-line email, "School covered." That was it. No thank you, no request for advice, no opening for more control. The silence after that email was loud. For 2 weeks I heard nothing, and then my dad texted asking for my portal login so he could check billing. I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen, and then I deleted it. Not replied, not argued, just deleted. That was when it really sank in. They wanted access not to help me, but to control me, and I was no longer handing that over. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that they would let me fade into the background while they showed off Ava's new life. But that was only the beginning, because once I stopped playing my assigned role, they started to panic in ways I did not see coming. And the first real sign of that panic showed up in a way that made me sit up straight, because it was not about money anymore, it was about ownership. And that, as you'll see, was a line I was never going to let them cross. When I started my first semester, I realized quickly that nothing was going to come easily, but I also realized that nothing could be taken from me because I had already been stripped of every illusion of support. I woke up before sunrise to swipe into my dining hall job, served eggs to students whose parents swiped credit cards without blinking, and then sat in classes where I pretended not to notice the subtle differences between me and the kids who never checked their bank accounts before buying a cup of coffee. In the evenings, I worked tutoring shifts, scribbling equations on whiteboards for classmates whose parents paid thousands for private help, while I was just grateful that my paycheck would cover groceries and the bus rides back to campus after late labs. The grind became routine, and I told myself that if I had to live on discipline instead of gifts, at least that was a currency no one could cut off. My parents were nowhere in sight during those months, except on my phone screen. Every time I opened social media, there was Ava in her SUV, parking by the beach, parking outside restaurants, parking in front of the house as my parents posed beside her with hashtags about pride and sacrifice. They were building a public narrative that screamed generosity, while I ate leftover sandwiches from the dining hall's closing shift. And yet, I never posted anything. I learned that silence can be sharper than arguments, because silence leaves people nothing to twist. Professor Elena Ruiz noticed me long before I thought anyone would. She was the first to pull me aside and say, "You're not just surviving this place, you're competing at a level most students never reach." When she nominated me for a departmental award, the stipend that came with it was small compared to the tuition I had already covered with scholarships. But to me it was proof that someone outside my family recognized effort without being prompted by a photo op. At the award reception, she introduced me to a group of donors who had created emergency funds for students like me, and in that moment I realized there were people who wanted to see me succeed, not because of what it would make them look like, but because they believed I had value on my own. Meanwhile, my parents sent group chat updates about Ava's road trips, captioned with lines like, "Earning your way through life." I wanted to reply with screenshots of bursar statements showing zero parental contributions, but instead I started keeping a folder of receipts. Every bursar email that confirmed a scholarship payment, every paycheck stub, every letter of recognition, I saved it all. It wasn't about proving myself to them anymore. It was about preparing for the moment when they would inevitably try to rewrite history. I had no doubt that day was coming, because people who thrive on appearances cannot stand being left out of the credits. When the university announced a family weekend, my department encouraged students to bring their parents for photos with faculty. I declined politely, saying I had scheduling conflicts, but what I really did was invite my roommate Tasha and a friend from the lab. They stood by me for every photo, and when people asked where my family was, I answered calmly, "The people who support me are here." No drama, no long story, just the truth in one sentence that no one could dispute. Later, Professor Ruiz leaned in and said, "When you deny people access to your story, they will invent one. Publish the version you want to own." That sentence lodged itself in my head. That night, I opened a free website builder and created a small portfolio. I listed my scholarships, my research projects, my award, and I wrote a single line of acknowledgement, grateful to mentors, friends, and colleagues who invested their time and energy. No mention of parents. No empty gestures. Just the truth. Within a week, the site link was included in the department newsletter, and donors began reaching out with opportunities. It was clean, factual, and impossible to contest. The fallout came quickly. My mother texted me a screenshot of the site with the words, "Why are your parents not mentioned?" A few minutes later she added, "Do you know how that looks?" I stared at those messages for a long time, feeling the irony burn through me. For years I had been told that nothing would be given to me, that I needed to learn independence, that I was on my own. And now, when I finally documented my independence, it was suddenly a public embarrassment for them. I typed the word "accurate" and hovered over the send button, my fingers shaking with the satisfaction that would come from pressing it. But I didn't send it. Not yet. Because I understood something in that moment. My silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy, and I wasn't going to waste a single move before the board was set. That was the night I understood that this was not about money anymore, and not even about recognition. This was about ownership of narrative. They wanted to be written into my story so they could stand under the applause, and I was finally in a position to keep them out. But even then I didn't know how far they would go to claw their way back into the picture, and the way they tried to do it almost derailed me. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't about appearances anymore. It was about paperwork, and once I discovered what they had done, I realized they were willing to cross lines that could have destroyed everything I had built. And that, I knew, was where the real fight would begin. The first sign that something had shifted from bruised pride to active interference arrived as a bland email from the aid office asking me to confirm new parental information. A phrase that looked harmless until I opened the portal and saw a half-finished form that did not come from me, with numbers that tried to pull me into a category that would lower my scholarship and raise what I supposedly owed. And the shock that ran through me was not the kind that makes you cry, but the kind that hardens your voice, because it was suddenly obvious that someone who had refused to pay $1 for my education now wanted to be listed as if they supported me. I walked to the bursar window with a folder of receipts I had been collecting for months, and I asked for a printout of every payment ever posted on my account, and when the clerk slid the papers across the counter, line after line of scholarship disbursements and work-study credits, and not a single entry from my family, the truth landed. With the weight of something you can hold in your hand and lay flat on a desk. I took those pages to the aide counselor, sat down, and spoke like someone who had finally run out of patience, but not out of proof. I explained that my privacy lock was active, that no one had permission to touch my records, and that whatever had been submitted needed to be removed and documented as unauthorized. The counselor was calm and professional, the kind of person who has seen this pattern more times than she wants to admit, and she nodded as she restored my status to what it should have been in the first place. She recommended that I add an extra layer of verification to block any future edits, and I agreed on the spot, because I had learned that you do not win these battles by outrage. You win them with systems that do not care about anyone's pride. A week later, a different envelope arrived at my apartment, the kind with government print and the kind of silence around it that tells you someone tried to gamble with rules instead of feelings. My tax return had been flagged because another filer had claimed me as a dependent, which would have been almost funny if it had not threatened the slim financial stability I was holding together with careful work and calendar blocks. I did not throw anything or make a dramatic call. I gathered my documentation, every pay stub, every rent receipt, every notice from the school confirming that tuition had been covered by scholarships and that housing and food were mine to solve. And I booked an appointment at the tax clinic the university ran for students like me. The advisor listened without flinching, made copies of my file, and walked me through the statement that would correct the record, and I signed with the steady hand of someone who knows that the truth, when it is organized and dated, moves like a slow bulldozer that does not stop. What I did next was nothing and everything. I let the process work. I did not forward the letter to my parents with a lecture. I did not start a group chat war. I did not write a paragraph about boundaries and betrayal, because I understood that sometimes the most precise kind of revenge is letting the institution that was manipulated send the message I could never send without being called dramatic or ungrateful. The notice would land in their mailbox with the cool voice of a rule book, and it would say what I had been saying with my choices for years. You do not get to claim what you did not build. During those days, I kept going to class and to work, but I also began tightening every gate around my life. I changed passwords, I confirmed with the registrar that my directory information would remain sealed, I asked the aid office to log any attempted access, and I told Professor Ruiz what had happened. Not because I wanted pity, but because I needed a witness who would not let me gaslight myself into thinking I had overreacted. She listened, folded her hands, and said that families who worship appearances get addicted to credit, and that when you cut off supply, they will look for back doors. Then she looked me in the eye and said that the only way to keep your voice is to be boringly consistent with your boundaries, and I believed her, because boring consistency was already the only reason I was still standing. Of course the phone calls started, and of course they came from numbers I did not recognize, and of course the voicemails were full of soft concern layered over hard instructions. My father's voice said we needed to align on some financial paperwork before graduation, as if this was a team project and not a cleanup of something he never should have touched. My mother's voice asked if I was ready to make a big moment for the family on the day I would walk across a stage I had earned without their help. I let the messages pile up while I cleaned my microwave, while I rolled laundry, while I recited a presentation I had to give in a seminar, because I refused to let their urgency become mine. The night before the departmental committee chose the student speaker for our smaller ceremony, Professor Ruiz emailed me a short note saying that my file had been discussed with unusual warmth and that I should sleep, because good things were moving. And I closed my laptop with the strange calm that arrives when you know you are almost out of a tunnel. Then I pressed play on one last voicemail from my father, a message that tried to sound practical but bled anxiety at every pause, where he said we needed to talk before the ceremony so nothing looked off in front of people. And I stood in my kitchen realizing that the real emergency, for them, was not my life or my future, but the possibility that their names would not be attached to my moment. I deleted the message without responding, and for the first time since this began, I did not feel guilty, because I had finally understood that you cannot protect your peace and their image at the same time, and the stage I was walking toward would not have room for both. On the morning the department emailed the final program, and I saw my name listed as student speaker for the college ceremony, I felt a calm that did not come from pride or nerves, but from a sense that all the small choices I had defended with quiet stubbornness were finally lining up into a single straight path. And although I knew that standing at a microphone would make certain people feel entitled to stand beside me, I had already done the work to make sure the stage would belong to those who actually carried me when it mattered. I went to the registrar to triple-check that my directory suppression covered the event rosters and the seating charts. I confirmed with the coordinator that guests could not pull student locations from staff, and I sent a short thank you to Professor Ruiz, who replied with an even shorter line that meant everything, a simple "speak like you are telling the truth to someone you love," which was, for once, instruction I knew how to follow without second guessing. The campus that weekend buzzed with a kind of curated excitement that always made me a little allergic, and as I walked past the information desk to pick up my name card, I saw my parents before they saw me. Not up close, but close enough to hear the way their voices carried when they insisted to an exhausted volunteer that there must be a way to find me in the crowd, because they were family and they had a spot to claim. And I watched the volunteer scroll a screen that did not contain me then point toward the general seating with an apologetic smile that said the rules were the rules even for people who had learned to bend them everywhere else. I kept moving, not because I was scared to be seen, but because I had already chosen not to be intercepted. And I had a speech to polish that was not going to waste a single sentence on people whose investment had been zero and whose appetite for credit was bottomless. Backstage, I sat with my note cards and read the opening aloud to Tasha, who was in the second row calmly chewing gum like a bodyguard in a hoodie, and I let each line find its weight. I thanked the night shift workers who swiped me into the dining hall when the scanner malfunctioned. I thanked the financial aid staff who stayed late on the phone while I cried into my sleeve and then took a breath and kept asking questions. I thanked the tutor desk that let me teach when I needed to feel useful. And I thanked Professor Ruiz for naming my work out loud in rooms where I could not enter yet, because that is what mentorship actually looks like. What I did not do was stretch the truth to make anyone comfortable, and I did not pad the ending with a generic tribute to blood ties, because telling the truth meant telling the truth all the way. I walked out when they said my name, and the room felt like any other room where people wait to be told a story that will not bore them, and I told it. Not with drama, but with detail, not with tears, but with receipts. The kind you collect in your head when you are trying to stay upright and nobody is looking, and when I said that this degree belonged to the people who invested when they had very little to spare, the applause did not come as a polite courtesy, but as a long, rolling answer, the kind that grows because people hear themselves in what you are saying and want to push you a little further along. I ended with a line I had written for myself months ago and had not known I would ever get to say out loud, a line about how gratitude does not require me to fictionize who showed up and who did not. And then I stepped back and let the silence settle before the next name was called. After the ceremony, I saw them again by the edge of the aisle, not raging, not even loud anymore, just urgent in that way people get when the photo they imagined has gone missing. And they approached Professor Ruiz with smiles that shook at the corners and asked if she could call me over for a family picture, because the grandparents were watching the live stream and they would really appreciate one shot of all of us together. And Ruiz looked across the room and found my eyes, and I shook my head once, a small movement that felt like a full sentence, and she turned back to them with the same kindness she shows to students who fail exams and want a map out of the wreckage, and she said that I was busy with my team and that they should enjoy the reception. Then she pressed a sealed manila envelope into my hands, told me the dean had asked her to deliver it, and added that I should open it when I could breathe, which might have been now or later depending on how much noise I needed to walk through first. At the donor brunch, I chose a table with the cafeteria crew and two students who had held me together during weeks when the closest thing to luxury I knew was an extra hour of sleep on a Sunday. And I let the room do whatever rooms do when families orbit their graduates with a mix of affection and performance, because my orbit had already been set, and my gravity did not run on their approval anymore. A development officer asked if I wanted to step aside for photos with relatives, and I said I was exactly where I needed to be, which was the truth, and then I watched out of the corner of my eye as my parents circled from staff member to staff member, repeating the story that they were trying to find me before the next event started, and it landed on me with a heaviness that felt strangely liberating that the thing they were chasing was not me, but the appearance of being close enough to claim me on a day when proximity mattered. The envelope in my bag felt heavier than paper, and I thought about opening it right there, but I kept it closed because I wanted to end the day on my own timing rather than theirs, and I wanted the last word to be mine even if I never said it out loud. Before I left the hall, I walked back to the podium, asked the technician for 30 seconds, and added a short unscripted coda, not rude and not petty but unmistakable, where I named again the people who had placed actual bricks under my feet when the path was all air, and I dedicated the next step of my life to doing that for someone else. The room stood, not everyone and not in perfect sync, but enough to make the floor vibrate, and when I stepped down I knew I had already delivered the only public answer my parents were ever going to get from me. Still, the day was not finished, because there was one last move I had been building toward quietly for months, a move that would not humiliate anyone or expose private wounds for sport, but would make sure that the spotlight landed exactly where it belonged and that the door behind me stayed closed to the hands that kept trying to pry it open, and as I walked outside and saw them pleading with a volunteer for my location again, I realized I did not need to correct them or confront them to win. I only needed to make the final announcement that would shift everything without ever saying their names. I woke up on the last morning of ceremonies with the stubborn clarity that comes when you have already survived the test, and all that remains is to decide who gets a seat in the story. And while the campus hummed with relatives jockeying for photo angles and centerpieces going home in tote bags, I kept my bag close not because it held anything expensive, but because it held a sealed envelope I was not ready to open until I had finished the thing I came here to do, which was to place the credit in the right hands and lock the door behind me without shouting or begging or performing. At the donor brunch, I thanked the staff who had slipped me meals at closing time when a swipe failed. I hugged Tasha with the quiet relief of someone who knows exactly who kept the roof from caving in when pride would have preferred silence. And I watched my parents circle reception tables like satellites trying to pull gravity from a planet that would not acknowledge their orbit, because without access to my schedule, my seating chart, or my phone, they had nothing but persistence, and persistence without permission is just noise in a room that has made up its mind. When the coordinator tapped the microphone and asked for everyone's attention for a short announcement, I walked to the podium with my heart steady and my notes simple. And I said that I had been carried here by people who gave time they did not have and patience they were not paid for, which is a kind of investment that never trends on a feed yet keeps students like me from dropping out on a Tuesday afternoon when a broken printer or a missed paycheck becomes the final straw, and I said that if I was going to claim my own agency now, then it could not be only for me, which is why, starting that day, the department would administer a small annual fund dedicated to emergency housing deposits and bridge expenses for first-generation students whose families could not or would not help. A fund seeded by the internship bonus I had protected like a winter coat and matched by donors I had met through Professor Ruiz, donors who told me that grown-ups build ladders even when their own rungs are still warm. The room did not erupt so much as swell, the kind of approval that has weight because it is not a performance. And I experienced an almost physical release in my chest when I saw the cafeteria crew clapping like I had handed them a receipt with their names on it, which in a way I had. I did not mention my parents, and I did not have to, because the insert in the printed program did that work with a single line that was both blunt and careful, a line that read, "Established in gratitude by a graduate whose family did not pay $1. And although that sentence could have been read as a jab, What it actually felt like was a boundary written in ink where no one could pretend it was a misunderstanding, and for the first time since the car with the bow appeared in our driveway, I felt the ratio of truth to noise tilt in my favor without me needing to raise my voice. From the corner of my eye, I saw my parents conferring with a staff member, hands open in a gesture that always used to mean I should accommodate, and I realized with a strange calm that there was nothing left for us to discuss in public. Because the story had already been told in a way that made room for gratitude without requiring me to falsify the past, and the people who needed to hear it had heard it. Only then did I slide the envelope from my bag and break the seal with the carefulness of someone who has learned to expect potholes even on paved roads. And inside was an offer letter for a paid fellowship that would carry me through the next year under the mentorship of a research team I admired from a distance, along with a handwritten note that said, "We back grown-ups," which landed like a hand on my shoulder. Steady and uncomplicated, and I laughed under my breath because after all the contortions I had performed to keep my life upright without making a spectacle, the reward for boring consistency turned out to be not applause or vindication, but freedom with a salary attached. I put the letter back in the envelope, not because I wanted to hide it, but because I wanted to keep the moment intact for myself before anyone else tried to narrate it for me, and I walked outside with the intention of leaving without theater. Just a quiet exit toward people who had actually earned an invitation into my day. By the main gate, my parents were still pleading with a volunteer to help them find me because there were relatives waiting at home and a photo would mean a lot, and for a long breath I stood far enough away that they could not pull me into their urgency. While close enough to understand that their panic was not about me at all, it was about losing the ability to reference me when they needed to look generous, which is a kind of hunger I cannot feed without starving everything that has kept me whole. I could have walked over and staged a picture and said something civil that would have satisfied a script we all knew by heart, but I thought about the paperwork they touched without permission, the messages wrapped in concern that were really instructions. The years of being told that independence was my responsibility until independence embarrassed them, and I chose a different ending that was quiet, final, and mine. I turned toward the group that had already started stacking chairs and stealing cookies for the road, and I raised my hand to get their attention, and they cheered like I had just announced a day off. And I felt the ground under me confirm that I had stepped fully into a life that does not require me to rent out my victories for the price of someone else's pride. As I walked away, I did not feel cruel or triumphant or even angry. I felt accurate, which is a rare and precious thing when you grow up in a house where image outruns truth. And I promised myself that this would be the last year I ever measured my choices against the need to keep anyone comfortable who did not keep me safe. I had broken the one rule that governed my family, the rule that says we never contradict the story, and I had not just survived, I had won, not because I humiliated anyone, but because I built a structure where people like me will not have to swallow quite as much to get to the same stage, and because I learned that the cleanest revenge is to live fully with receipts that do not need your parents' signatures, while your name, spoken into a microphone you earned, becomes the only introduction you will ever need.